and welcome to episode 15 of Lex Out Loud, world building for science fiction. I'm your host, Lex Starwalker. I'm working on my third novel, my first science fiction novel, and I'm taking you along with me for the ride. In season 1, I'm exploring world building in depth. So today, I'm going to talk about animals in space. So it turns out, and this was surprising to me, there's a bit of a debate to be had here. Whether you've ever thought about this or not, I think chances are that you have assumptions that you make that put you on one side of this debate or the other. So let's examine and challenge some of these assumptions and see if we can answer the question, will we really take animals to live with us in space? But before we get into that, I just want to make an announcement to you today. This probably won't mean much to a lot of you, but I am no longer going to be putting out the LOL scripts. So if you're a patron of the show at the $10 level or higher, I was releasing to those patrons the actual scripts that I use recording the episodes. Well, a couple weeks or so ago, I asked the patrons on Patreon in our Discord server whether they were using those, whether they found them helpful, whether they valued them or not. And I actually only heard from a few people, and of the few people I heard from, none of them seemed to even be reading the scripts, definitely weren't finding them terribly useful. And pretty much what I was told was that people were finding what they needed in the show notes and really had no use for the full script. So I'm not going to do them anymore because that was adding some time to the production of the show, because I would take my actual script that I used to produce the show, and a lot of times I would edit it a little bit just to make it a little cleaner for people to see, and I would upload that to our Patreon, and it just added some extra steps to the production of the show, added some time to the time that it takes to do. And since no one was using them, it seems completely wasted time. I'm always looking for good rewards for the patrons, for the people that are kind enough to support the show and what I'm doing. And I was really, when I came up with the idea, I thought maybe that would be something that people would like and would find valuable, but doesn't seem to be the case. But, that's okay. We tried it and, it didn't pan out. But I'm not too upset about it because it will save me quite a bit of time in the production of the show. And also because of that, I can approach how I produce the show a little differently. So up till now, for the most part, all of the episodes I produced, I write a script for, and I follow the script when I record the episode. Now, I don't always read it word for word, but I follow it pretty closely. So that adds quite a bit of time to the production of the show, not just the time to edit the script and upload it to Patreon and all that, but also just the time writing the script. Instead of just, making a short outline, a few bullet points of what I want to talk about, I sit down and write a whole script, which often will take an hour, a couple hours, even longer, depending on what the topic is or whatever. So that's some time I can save if I'm not giving these scripts to the patrons, then I don't necessarily need a full script to record a podcast. So in the future, you may find that episodes might be a little more off the cuff since I'm not going to be writing full scripts anymore. I went back and I track all my time for things, and I looked to see how much time I've been spending producing each episode, and I was a little surprised to learn that I've been spending between 6 and 8 hours producing most of the episodes of this show. And that's just way, way more time than I want to be spending on this. My number one priority right now is writing the book I'm writing, not this podcast. Sorry. So yes, spending 6 to 8 hours per episode is just way, way too much time. It's not sustainable. Either I won't be getting episodes out very often, or I will be sacrificing writing time to put out the show, which is not something I want to do. So it's just too much time away from working on the book. And also sometimes means that episodes come out less frequently because it takes more time to produce them. So I'm still planning to do outlines for the episodes so they're not completely rambling, although some of you said you're fine with rambling episodes. So hopefully they'll still be, focused and to the point. But I'm not going to write the full scripts anymore. So that should save me quite a bit of time in the production. And I may also occasionally do episodes without even an outline, just completely off the cuff, just have an idea what I'm going to talk about, hit the red button and go. I think that this will enable me to get episodes out more frequently and more regularly. And again, will help me avoid spending too much time on the podcast to the detriment of my writing projects. So yeah, that's the plan going forward. So, but again, before we get into our main topic today, just some updates on where I'm at in the project and kind of where I think maybe this show is going in the near future. So, as I've been saying in some of the more recent episodes, I'm pretty much done with my world building now, at least as far as the bulk of it that needs to be done before I really start writing. World building really never ends, and there are definitely some things still yet to do. For instance, I do have a pretty good list of countries I think will be involved in building this first city-sized cylinder. But I still want to research the cultures of those countries and find elements I can bring into the story. And I haven't even gotten started on that yet. So there's quite a bit of research and world building yet to do there. And there are always things, there are always questions left to answer. But I have enough of a framework established now, enough of a foundation that I think I can start writing and just do the rest as I go, as it becomes needed. So with that being the case, more and more I've been thinking about and focusing on developing the main characters for the story and the plots and the conflicts that are going to be involved in this first book. So I guess maybe I might be wrapping up season 1 of the show soon. I don't know about that. You look at the title of this podcast and it's Lex Out Loud hyphen world building for science fiction. And the idea was the first season of the show was going to be really focused on world building, which for the most part is what we've been talking about so far. And I guess it would just take longer to get through the world building and I guess to say everything I wanted to say about the world building. But here it is, episode 15, and I'm already nearing the end of what I have to say about world building at this point. I feel like it's a little soon to call it the end of season 1. I just started this show in December, I think, November or December, I think, is when I started working on it, and episodes started coming out the end of December. And it's only now April, so it's only been a little over 4 months. So kind of a short season. If you look at TV shows, I mean, well, actually these days, 15 episodes would be a really long season for a TV show. But, TV shows usually only put out one season per year. So I don't want to say, this is the end of season 1 and see you guys in a year. So I don't know. I don't know what I'm going to do as far as that. But I mean, I guess it doesn't really matter. I'm the only one that probably even cares about that stuff. But yeah, regardless what I decide to do as far as if I'm going to call it an end of season 1 and start season 2 or just change the tagline or the subtitle or what I'm going to do as far as that kind of stuff, definitely wrapping up the world building focus part of the show. So I'm going to, in probably the next few episodes, start answering your questions that you've given me about the setting. It looks like there's going to be nowhere near 20 questions, but that's honestly okay because the questions that I have gotten from you have all been pretty in-depth questions. They're not questions you can answer with just a few words or a few sentences. So it would take forever to get through 20 questions like that anyway. So I will, I think, tackle the ones I can tackle here in the next few episodes. And yeah, I think that'll be kind of it for the world building focused stuff, which, like I said, doesn't mean I'm never going to talk about world building again. but means that won't necessarily be the focus of every episode going forward. So if you do have any questions about the setting that I haven't answered or you haven't asked, now is the time to ask those. So the best way to do that is either in our Discord server, and you can find a link to that server in our show notes at starwalkerstudios.com/LOL, or you can email me at lexoutloudpodcast@gmail.com. And like I said, in the near future, I'll start going through those, and I don't know if I'll be able to answer all of them right now, but I'll at least answer the ones that I can right now, and maybe come back to the other ones at some later date. Just because some of them I don't honestly have answers for yet, and I'm not sure when I will. Some of them aren't necessarily questions I need to answer right now, and I don't want to fall prey to world builder's disease and just world build forever and just put off doing world building that I don't really need to do right now. So yeah, we'll see how that goes. So again, if you have any questions, let me know. Now is the time. So yeah, I'm pretty much done with the world building, and I'm brainstorming ideas for characters and ideas for plots for the first book. And I'll be discussing those kinds of things more in the near future. All right, so today's topic is animals in space. And I would have never guessed that this would be a topic on this show a few months ago. This was never even something I'd ever even really thought about before. And kind of an interesting side note as part of this discussion is just some thoughts on assumptions and how we're always making assumptions and we always have our biases, whether or not we're aware of them. And oftentimes there are assumptions that we're making and biases that we have that we're completely unaware of until something happens that makes us aware of them. And this is exactly what happened with this whole idea of animals in space. So what happened was I was reading this paper called Space Settlements and Design Study, which I've talked about on the show before. And this paper was written, I don't remember the exact date, but it was in the early 70s, if I remember right. And this was all about how would we build habitats in space? What would they be like? Things like that. And it was a serious study that was done by a group of people. If I'm remembering right, it was spearheaded by NASA. Again, I've talked about this in much more detail in previous episodes, so you can go check those out. But as I was reading through this lengthy paper on this topic, and I mean, it went into how the orbitals would be designed in and out, how they would be built, all these kinds of things. And one of the things that really took me by surprise was the writers of this paper explicitly made the assumption that there would be livestock on these orbitals, that there would be cows and chickens and goats and all this stuff. And that really floored me. Now, my first thought was, well, this was written in 1970. That was a long time ago. That was what, 60 years ago now, 50 years ago? I can do math, I promise. But it was a long time ago. A very different world back then, a very different paradigm, yada, yada, yada. So that was kind of my first thought. I'm like, well, they wrote these in 1971 or 73 or whatever it was. And yeah, that was an assumption they made back then for whatever reasons. But we've come a long way since then. And at least in my mind, this idea of, that we would be living in these huge rotating orbitals in space and we'd have cows and chickens and pigs and whatnot with us, to me was just kind of ludicrous. But I started thinking about it, right? Because I'm like, wow, here's this thing that I never really thought about explicitly or consciously before. Like, would there be cows on these cylinders? Because to me, the answer was so obvious, it didn't even need thinking about. Well, of course not. Why would there be? But then I'm reading this paper and here are these really smart people, granted from 50 years ago, but these really smart people making the opposite assumption that of course there would be cows and chickens and pigs and all these things. So yeah, that was just interesting. The assumptions we make and why we make them, and how surprising it can be when someone challenges an assumption that you've always had but maybe never really thought about, and how sometimes when you start to examine these assumptions, they're built on nothing. They don't hold water very well. So I thought I would talk about this because even today in the year 2021, there are differences in opinions on this, which you can easily see by the assumptions people are making in the modern day. For instance, the guy Brian Versteeg, I believe is his name, going by memory, who is the artist who's made these beautiful images of the Kalpana 1 orbital, which is the one that I'm most basing my cylinders off of. He's made these beautiful images, and he's done 3D videos of the exterior and the interior, and I've posted some links to those in our Discord, so definitely check those out. They're really cool. But he makes this assumption as well that, oh yes, we'll have animals on these things. So, I mean, he's not a scientist or anything, or an agriculturalist or anything like that. But still, he's someone that I assume is fairly well versed in the subject of space orbitals and whatnot. And he still, in 2021, assumes that that we'd have animals on these things. And I asked in our Discord, the listeners in the Discord about it, said that I wanted to talk about this in an episode, and was asking for any thoughts people had either for or against having animals in space. And even among the listeners in the Discord, that it was not, there were people on both sides of this debate, if you will. So I find that really interesting. So I have my own opinions, and I'm my opinions are pretty strong. I do think that they're rooted in realities of culture and biology and things like that. But my belief or my assumptions are not universal, and not everybody agrees. So I thought it would be an interesting thing to talk about. And I will try to do my best to give you some of the reasons that are given for having animals in space, and some of the reasons against. And then I'll let you know what I'm going to do in my book, and why I'm doing what I'm doing. But I just think it's a really interesting topic. And, there may be people listening to this that will be alive in the future when we get a real answer, for sure. But until then, it's a matter of opinion and conjecture. So let's start with reasons for. So reasons why some people think that we would have animals with us in space. And I'm including both animals like livestock that are raised for food purposes, as well as pets, cats, dogs, hamsters, whatever that people might want to have. And some of these reasons are the reasons that were given in Settlements and Design Study. And so actually I'm going to go out of order of my outline here, which is really dangerous. Or actually, I don't have this on the outline. Wow. The number one reason isn't on here. Okay, well, I now added it to my outline, even though I'm not sure why, because I'm not publishing these anymore. But anyway, the first reason, and this was one that was mentioned in Space Settlements and Design Study, and in there, it was kind of just given as the obvious reason, and also kind of the end of the argument reason, which is to make it more like Earth. So one of the fundamental philosophies of the people that wrote Settlements a Design or Space Settlements a Design Study was that we would want to make these environments as Earth-like as possible. So the idea is we're going to have these huge orbital habitats in space with Earth-like gravity, and that people will live their entire lives there. They'll be born there, they'll live there, and they'll die there. They'll have their kids there. Families will live there for generations and generations. So that being the case, obviously you want people to be healthy, and you want people to be psychologically healthy and happy. And the belief is, and it's a belief I agree with, that one way to achieve that is to make the environment as Earth-like as possible. And there's a lot of discussions about this in the paper. Things like breaking up your point of view so you don't see the shape of the cylinder, so that it seems you're in a bigger space than you are. Having wide open spaces so that you can feel like you're in the open air. Having plants, not only for food purposes, but just to beautify the environment, and things like flowers that are not only nice to look at, but make the air smell nice and are relaxing, and all these things to provide fresher air and even some oxygen. And yeah, that I totally agree with. We definitely have plants all over the place, and that's what I'm planning. And also another factor of this is in the very beginning of building these things, you're going to want to entice people to go live there, right? Like, why is someone going to leave their apartment in a city on Earth and go live in an apartment in a city up in space? So in the beginning, at least, you'll need incentives to get people to do that. And I think a lot of those incentives will be economic. And as part of that, and this is how I'm doing it in my setting, one of those early incentives is that for the same amount of money as what you would pay in rent for an apartment in, say, New York City, up in one of these orbital habitats, for that same amount of rent, you could get a much larger and more luxurious apartment than you could in New York City. So right there's an incentive, right? It's like, well, I could get an apartment with 2-3 times the square footage, and have access to all this, all natural food and blah, 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 blah. Like I'll be living in luxury for the same or less rent than I would pay for my apartment down on Earth. It's a third of the size or whatever. So, that would be a pretty good incentive. But, as part of that, it needs to be a place people want to live. It needs to be beautiful and aesthetically pleasing and all those things. So, yeah, one of the reasons given for, yes, of course, we'd have cows and whatnot on these things is to make it more Earth-like, to make it seem more like Earth, more like home. Another reason is that if we're going to be growing all these plants, we're going to be growing fruit trees for fruit and herbs for cooking, and, our grains and vegetables, as well as just ornamental plants and flowers and things like that. We may even be growing trees for structural, architectural purposes. That's an idea I'm really considering is that some structural elements of the interiors of these habitats will actually be made of wood for a lot of these same reasons. It's comforting and relaxing. It absorbs sound and prevents echo. It helps provide more even heating of the space. It absorbs and doesn't reflect light, so it can help diminish eye strain from these harsh environments as far as lighting. So there's a lot of good reasons to use wood in the interior architecture of these things. And I mean, sure, you can bring lumber up the space elevator, but even easier and more cost effective if you can grow trees on the habitats themselves, especially if maybe you can genetically modify trees to grow even straighter or whatnot, if you're using them for architectural elements or whatever. So anyway, if you have all these different kinds of plants growing, you're probably going to need pollinators, right? So, we might need things like honeybees or mason bees or various types of flies or whatever to pollinate all these plants so that they can bear fruit and vegetables and all that good stuff. Another reason given for having animals on your habitat is for fresh meat, So you have cows for your beef and chickens for your chicken and things like that. Another reason for would be for other animal products like eggs and dairy, cheese, yogurt, milk, things like that. There's also the possibility of psychological benefits of having animals on the habitats above and beyond just making it seem more Earth-like. And that's probably more specifically dealing with pets, if people have pets. And there have been studies that have shown that people who have pets tend to recover better from depression or things like a death in the family, tend to de-stress better. Petting your dog or your cat can be soothing and help you cope with stress of life and whatnot. So there's definitely an argument to be made for the psychological benefits of people having access to pets. And then another possibility is maybe pest control, things like rats and mice. Now, I've kind of gone back and forth on this a bit. I believe our listener Helga in the Discord is the one who brought this one up. And I hadn't even thought of it, honestly. And my first thought was, well, there wouldn't be any. How would mice or rats or anything like that get onto an orbital up in space unless you intentionally brought them? How would they be there? And why would you bring them unless you had mice for, I don't know, research or something and they escaped or something? I don't know. But I don't remember if it was Helga or not, but someone in the Discord brought up the point of, well, all of your legitimate cargo and whatnot that's brought up is surely inspected and there's no mice in there or anything like that. But, you're probably going to have smuggling and whatnot going on. I mean, you can never really completely get rid of that kind of thing. So maybe you'd have pests and rodents and whatnot that are coming aboard on these, this stuff that's smuggled up that doesn't go through the proper channels and whatnot. And at first I was like, yeah, that's a really good point. But I thought about it more, and really, at least with my cylinders, these habitats I'm going to have in my setting, the way most of their imports are brought is, at least stuff coming from Earth, is by space elevator. And even if your car on your space elevator can accelerate at 1G the whole way, which I'm not sure how feasible that is in the time frame I'm talking about, but even if you can do that massive acceleration the whole way, it would still take over an hour to get from Earth up to the habitat. So, I don't think you're going to have mice being, coming up on things that are smuggled because when you're dealing with cargo that isn't some kind of life form, it's not going to have life support on the space elevator. So, maybe there's a mouse or a rat in some crate that's smuggled up, but that crate still has to go up the space elevator and it's going to be in an oxygen-free environment the whole time. So that mouse is going to be long dead from suffocation before it gets up to the orbital. So yeah, I mean, you might have some issues with any bacteria or whatnot that mouse is carrying surviving that. But the mouse itself and any kind of macro level, pests like mammals aren't going to survive that trip. So yeah, I don't think that would be very common at all for that to happen. And even if it did somehow happen that some mouse or rat or something or a pigeon or whatever somehow got onto this orbital, part of how these things work that I don't know that I've really talked about on the show before is, you have this cylinder-shaped structure in space. It's spinning for artificial gravity. And in order to keep that thing stable, you need to distribute your weight evenly, and this is, this is pretty easy to imagine. Imagine, spinning a Frisbee or something on the tip of your finger. Now imagine spinning that Frisbee and you tape something heavy to one side of it, right? It's not going to spin very well, right? Because it's off balance. One side is a lot heavier than the other side. It's going to wobble. It's not going to spin right. So you have the same kind of thing with these cylinders. You need to have the weight evenly distributed around the cylinder on all sides for it to spin stably and not wobble or anything like that. So obviously, when they're designing and building the thing, they will distribute weight as evenly as they can. But, as soon as you start thinking much about it, you realize that it would never be possible to make it perfect. And even if you did make the weight perfectly distributed, that's going to go out the window as soon as you put people on board, because people are moving around all the time. They're moving objects around all the time. So that the weight in different areas of the cylinder is not static. It's constantly changing. So, for instance, in the Kalpana cylinder, the way they propose dealing with this is basically around the perimeter of the cylinder, around the equator, you could say, are counterweights on cables or chains. And so these can be reeled out or reeled in as needed to adjust the weight so that it is evenly distributed. So the way this is going to work on my cylinders is this whole system is controlled by a very sophisticated AI. And part of how this AI does its job is it monitors everything down to the gram, probably down to the microgram on the cylinder. So it monitors the movement of every person, every object, everything on the cylinder in order to calculate which weights need to be extended, which weights need to be retracted. And this is all done by the millisecond in real time, so that at any given moment, that cylinder is perfectly balanced so that it spins stably. So even if somehow a mouse or a rat or something like that smuggled itself on board, this AI would detect it immediately. And I'm sure if this was a thing that ever happened, that they would have robots that were specifically designed to deal with pests. So pests, I don't know if that comes across, that word. It might sound like I'm saying pets. So, all this AI has to do is it detects a mouse or a rat running around the station, and it informs one of these robots, and they go deal with it. So that mouse or that rat wouldn't be an issue for very long at all. So, yeah. So that's something I'm pretty sure I haven't talked about on the show, but that's something that's going on. And actually, one of the ideas I'm kicking around for the story is whether or not there is something like what we would today call strong AI or a sentient AI. And if there is, it's probably this AI handling this thing, this system of the counterweights and whatnot. So that might be something I actually explore in the story. All right. So those are kind of the reasons for it as I could come up with them. So again, real quickly, some reasons why we might have animals on our space habitats in the future are to make it more Earth-like for people so they can feel more at home, so that you can have your pollinators to pollinate all your plants, so you can have fresh meat to eat, so you can have other animal products, eggs, dairy products, things like that. And also possibly maybe things like wool and leather for clothing. I mean, I don't know if that'd really be a thing in the future, but it might be. I don't know. For pets, people might want to have pets. And finally, I guess I got a little sidetracked. So the last possible reason was for pest control. And the idea being, well, maybe you would need cats or something like that, some kind of predators to hunt any pests that there might be. But I just explained why I don't think pets or pests would be a factor. And even if they were, those would be dealt with by robots, which would be far more efficient and effective at hunting those things than cats would be. It's kind of interesting. One of the assumptions people often make for why we have house cats is that people domesticated cats to keep, rats and mice away from the grain bins and things like that. And that's actually not really seriously considered to be likely, just because cats actually are not at all efficient at hunting mice and rats and at keeping them out of those places. You can have all the barn cats you want. There's still going to be mice and rats. So, it's not really something that really holds up as far as that's why we have cats, is to keep the mice away. All right. So those are our reasons that maybe we might have animals on the habitats in the future. And now I'm going to go into my reasons why we wouldn't. And some of these, or a lot of these, are going to be responses to some of the reasons given that we would. All right. So, like we just talked about, one of the reasons that people think that we might have animals on these things is for fresh meat. So people can have fresh meat to eat. I think a reason against would be that people probably won't be eating meat anymore. Or if they are, they won't be eating it very much. I'm thinking probably around 200 years in the future for this. And, already today we see, at least here in the United States, we see less consumption of meat by people as time goes on for various reasons. But people eat less meat now than they did 100 years ago. And I think that trend is going to continue for various reasons. So I think in the future, 200 years in the future, honestly, I think by that point, people won't be eating meat at all. I don't think they'll even be eating meat grown in a lab, which I think will be a intermediary stage. I think before humans give up eating meat altogether, that there'll be this intermediate period where we're still eating meat, but all of that meat is grown. It's muscle tissue that's grown. It's not meat that's harvested from an animal that's slaughtered. So I think that for a time that will be the case, and people will still eat meat, but it will be grown meat. But eventually even that will phase out and people just won't eat meat anymore. And I think 200 years is long enough that will have happened. Or at the very least, it will have happened among people living in space. So people either won't be eating meat at all, or they won't be eating very much meat. And even if they are eating a little meat, it will be something that they're willing to give up to live in space. And it will be something that they have to give up to live in space. So, it's today we have to make decisions like this or not. Maybe there's this really, really nice apartment that you want, but you're not allowed to have pets. So, what's more important to you, having a pet or living in your dream apartment? Now, some people will turn down the apartment because they want to have a pet, and then other people will be more than happy to not have a pet if it means living in their dream apartment. And those are the people that will be going up to live in space, not the people who refuse to go if they can't take their dog with them. So to kind of dig into this a little bit more as to why I think people will be eating very little or no meat at this point in the future, one reason for that is just for health reasons. Studies have consistently shown that diets that are low in meat or that don't include meat are healthier than ones that do, due to lower levels of saturated fat and cholesterol, and that people that have those diets have longer lifespans. For numerous years in a row now, they do studies every year about how long people live in various parts of the world and correlating it with their diets. And for numerous years now, the Mediterranean diet wins every year. They're the longest lived, healthiest people are people people eating the Mediterranean diet. And the Mediterranean diet involves very little to no meat. In fact, you're eating meat maybe a number of times per month, and even then very small amounts, especially compared to what most people here in the United States would think of. My wife and I actually, as kind of our New Year's resolution this year, we started following the Mediterranean diet, which we were pretty close already. And we got a Mediterranean diet cookbook that was written by an actual dietitian who knows what she's talking about. And yeah, we've really been enjoying it and not missing really any of the things that we quote had to give up. But one thing that's mentioned in that book that we got is that, here in the United States, so often when you think of a quote traditional American meal, the meat is front and center stage, right? The meat is the main course. It gets the spotlight on your plate, and then you have maybe a salad or a vegetable or some kind of side with it. But the meat is really what the meal's about. Where in the Mediterranean diet, the main thing is the vegetables, and the meat, if it's even there, is a garnishment or a side. So some places in the world you're already seeing this where people eat very little to no meat, and studies have shown those people live longer. So as time goes on, that knowledge is going to continue to disseminate. And more people are going to be aware of that as time goes on. And more people will choose not to eat meat just for health reasons. And I would argue that much of our meat consumption today and our consumption of other animal products, at least in the United States and places like it, is really due more to our culture and what we're used to than any kind of a nutritional need. It's not that there aren't other ways to get those nutrients that aren't just as good. It's just we like to eat what we're used to eating. And that's the real reason. It's part of our culture. So a vegetarian diet can provide complete nutrition, just like one with animal products does. And it can easily be far cheaper than one including animal products. And I think this will just become more and more true as time goes on. But, I notice right now with the pandemic, our meat prices have gone up. In fact, last year, when this pandemic first started, I was still buying bacon and sausage and things like that at the grocery store because we hadn't started the Mediterranean diet yet. And I stopped around summertime last year because the prices kept going up. And that's not good for you. There's much healthier things to eat than bacon and sausage. So I stopped buying it because it was getting so expensive. And it's just going to become more and more the case, especially as people eat less meat and there are less people producing meat, less meat industry. Those prices will continue to go up. While at the same time, the prices of vegetable products and mushroom products and things like that will keep going down. So, I think a lot of these cultural holdovers that lead to people eating meat and other animal products will diminish over time, especially when you pair that with economic incentive of it's just cheaper not to buy meat, and also the health incentive of it's healthier not to eat meat. So all of those things are working together over time to lead to people eating less and less meat. And another one, and this is a huge one, and I think honestly, this reason alone is enough and is really, in my mind, really the only reason I spent much time thinking about, because I think this is the real reason. If we have to boil down the one reason why we will not have animals on our space habitats, it's because they are disease vectors. That's where most diseases come from originally, is they come from an animal. So I've learned this going to school for anthropology. I learned about how in some ways people were a lot healthier when we were hunter-gatherers, in the way that there was less disease, because when people started doing agriculture, well, first you had more people living more closely together than you ever had before. When people were hunters and gatherers, social groups were forced to stay small. Your tribe or whatever had to be below a certain size in order for you to be able to find enough resources in the environment to feed everyone. And you just couldn't go above a certain amount of people, where with agriculture, it's the opposite. You actually benefit from having more people available to farm, you can produce more food in the same area with more people. And you can support more people in the same area because you can grow a lot more food in a given area than the land would just naturally produce if you're just hunting for wild game and gathering wild, nuts and plants and whatnot. So agriculture led to a lot more people living much more closely together, which greatly facilitated transmitting disease from person to person. And also, for the first time, people were living in very close proximity to different species of animals that were being raised in, not always the cleanest conditions. And you have different species living together. You have diseases mutating and spreading from one species to another. And yeah, it was a price we paid when we adopted agriculture. There were some prices to be paid. It wasn't all just everything was better. So as much as all of that is true here on Earth, it would be even more true in space in a hermetically sealed, contained environment. You can argue that the planet Earth is a contained environment, which it is, but it's an extremely huge one. As big as these cylinders are that I'm talking about, they're nothing compared to the size of the Earth. So disease would spread through them much more quickly and much easily, and diseases would transmit between species much more quickly and easily on one of these habitats. And that right there is enough of a reason not to do it, especially when there's really no compelling reasons to do it. Okay, another one. This is just a short one, but people have allergies. I have allergies. People are allergic to animals and their dander and things like that. So yeah, there's a good reason not to have animals around, because a significant portion of your population is going to be allergic to them. And again, you're in a much more enclosed environment. So it will be more difficult to keep those allergens away from the people that are bothered by them. Also, there are a lot of problems with the meat industries on Earth today that I think are also going to be very large factors in the contributing to the phasing out of meat over time. A big one is animal cruelty. And I think that will be just more and more of an issue as time goes on, as we learn more and more about human intelligence and animal intelligence and how the brains and nervous systems of different species work. I think this, what I believe to be erroneous and very self-serving and convenient view and belief that humans are somehow on another level from animals, and animals can't think like we do, or can't feel like we do, or don't feel pain like we do, or whatever it is that the farmers and meat producers tell themselves to get through the day every day, and to sleep at night. Those things are just going to be harder and harder to justify as time goes on and we learn more and more. And I grew up on a farm. I've worked on farms. I've worked with animals on farms. And if you don't know what goes on at farms, you don't want to know, honestly. But animals are treated incredibly cruelly and inhumanely. And as we continue to evolve as a species, there will come a point where we will no longer be able to justify it, especially when all these supposed reasons to do it keep falling away year after year. Also, the meat industries have very negative impacts on the environment. A lot of the deforestation that occurs on Earth right now is due to the meat industries, to clearing land for pastures and whatnot. This is also leading to a great reduction in the diversity of plant life and plant species on Earth as more and more natural landscapes are cleared to raise animals. And also leads to the degradation of soil because, a lot of that's due to just growing a handful of crops and growing lots of them everywhere. And a lot of that is due to the meat industry, because a lot of those crops are actually not grown to feed people. They're grown to feed livestock. And then there's also the whole thing of cattle producing huge amounts of methane gas throughout the world. Which is a greenhouse gas. They're a significant contributor to the buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So these are all reasons that people are going to look less and less favorably on raising animals for food as time goes on. That's just going to be more and more the case every year that goes by, every generation that goes by. And then, if we start thinking about actually being in space, it's far easier and cheaper to grow plants in space than it would be to raise animals, if that would even be possible, which at this point we don't even know, honestly, that it would be possible to raise animals in space. And raising animals would be a lot more expensive than raising plants. Another thing I don't think that can be overstated is the smell. Have you ever lived on a farm? Have you ever been on a farm or just driven by a farm? The smell can be extremely unpleasant and extremely potent. And again, will be something that's much harder to get away from on an enclosed cylinder. Now, a big argument for having animals on our habitats actually doesn't have to do with any of this stuff that I've been talking about of meat consumption and animal product consumption, but has to do with the practice of having animals as pets, right? Like a lot of people have pets. I really think by this point in the future that people that still have animal pets will be pretty rare if they even exist. I think people will have robot pets, honestly. Already, we have manufacturers making various types of robot pets. And, right now it's a novelty. And right now, to my knowledge, there's not a robot out there that can really replace your cat or your dog or even your hamster. But in the future, they will be able to, and they will. I don't want to offend anyone, but just keep in mind, I don't know you or who you are or what you do. But I will say, as someone who's grew up on a farm, I've been around animals my whole life. I've loved animals my whole life. I've had pets my whole life. I've been around people who have pets my whole life. It is amazing to me how many people who have pets take horrible care of their pets. Where I grew up in the country in Indiana, I knew so many people that had dogs who were on chains in their yards and were never off the chains. The dogs never got walked. They lived in a short radius determined by the length of their chain, and that was their world. I knew people who had dogs kept in cages their entire lives. Not cool, I don't know why those people had pets. I think a lot of them, it was for security. So they'd have a dog that would bark if someone came over or whatever. But people take horrible care of their pets. Now I live in a more urban environment, and where I live now, I live in the Pacific Northwest, people love their pets here. People dote on their pets here. And yet there are people all around me where I live who never walk their dogs, who think they can just let their dog out into their tiny little fenced in yard and that's sufficient for it, that it gets enough exercise and whatnot from that. Especially, around here, Huskies are really popular. And I love Huskies. They're the sweetest dogs. And I've wanted to have a Husky for years, since I was in high school. So I did research in the Huskies, and I learned that you should not have a Husky if you're not willing to walk your dog at least twice a day. And in fact, you should not have a Husky unless your dog every day will have an opportunity to run as fast as it can for as long as it wants to. Huskies need that. And yet I see people around here all the time who have Huskies, and, they may take them for a walk around town or whatever, but they never get to run, and they're not psychologically healthy. They're not happy, truly. So I'm saying all this to say that today we have a lot of people who have pets for whatever reason they want a pet or think they want a pet, and they don't take care of them. They don't feed them right. They don't exercise them right. They don't give them the attention that they need. For instance, I have a cat And we've watched a show a lot called My Cat from Hell, which is a great show, by the way, but where people have these, quote, problem cats, and this guy comes and helps them. And pretty much every time, the problem isn't actually the cat. It's the people that have the cat and the fact that they're not playing with the cat. They're not stimulating the cat in the right way. So the cat, quote, acts out. So there are all these people that have pets for whatever reason, but for whatever reasons, they refuse to take care of them like they should. Well, in the future, that you won't have to have that problem because people can have pets that are actually robots, but that look just like a real dog or a cat, act just like a real dog or a cat. There's no way you can tell that they're not a real dog or a cat, except for the fact that when you don't want to deal with your pet, you can just turn it off and put it on a shelf, which is what I feel like a lot of pet owners today actually want. If you look at how they treat their pets, when they want to interact with the dog or the cat, then that's great. But the rest of the time, the thing should shut up and stay out of their way. They're not willing to walk their dog twice a day. They're not willing to play with their cat every day. They complain about emptying the litter box or whatever, right? So in a future where you have the choice of two pets that in every measurable way are identical, but one of them, whenever you don't want to deal with it, you can turn it off and put it away guilt-free. And the other one will involve numerous chores every day that you're not going to want to do. Which do you think people are going to pick? And also the robot pet will never get sick. It will never die. It won't get old. It won't go blind. It won't suddenly start peeing all over the place because it has a urinary infection or whatever. So I think a lot of people that think they want pets really don't. They want a toy that they can play with when they want to play with it and ignore it the rest of the time. And robot pets will be perfect for those people. And I think, there are people that really do want pets and that really enjoy taking care of their pets and are fantastic, pet owners and do everything they should, and maybe those people will choose to stay on Earth for those reasons because they want to have animals around them, or maybe they will find other ways to channel those aspects of their personality either into their robot pet or into plants that they're raising or their children or whatever. But I think just very simply that by this point, robotics and artificial intelligence will be so advanced that manufacturers will be able to make robot versions of any pet you could imagine that will be indistinguishable from the real thing, other than the fact that you don't have to feed it, you don't have to clean its litter box, et cetera, et cetera. Which is not to say that as soon as that happens, everyone going to go get rid of their pets and get robot pets. Of course not. But over time, that will be more and more the case. And again, you have to think that when the point comes that people can go up into space and live in an orbital, there are going to be people who are willing and want to do that. And there are going to be people who are not willing or don't want to do that. And yeah, I think that the people that really want to go live in space will either be more than happy with a robot pet, or it will be something that it's a sacrifice they'll be willing to make to have this thing that they want. Also, another part of this is animals, especially pets, but all animals really aren't really controllable unless you're going to keep them completely confined 24/7, which isn't humane. And especially this far in the future, I don't think is going to be something that would fly. Unless you do that, they're not controllable, not completely. So there's always going to be some safety risks involved, which is another reason I don't think it'll be a thing. They're also destructive to the environment. No matter what you do, they're very destructive to their environment. And these are very expensive environments that we're talking about. Another thing I got to say especially about cats specifically, but I think it's true to some degree with any kind of animal, is have you ever taken a cat in a car? Now, I'm sure, there are people out there that be like, oh, my cat loves riding in a car, and I'm sure it does. But in general, cats do not enjoy riding in cars. And especially if you take a cat in a car who's never been in a car before, it's a nightmare. So imagine trying to take that thing up a space elevator or on a rocket and then put it in a big spinning cylinder. Yeah, it's not going to be fun for you. It's not going to be fun for the animal. And again, if we start questioning ethics and humaneness, is it really ethical or moral to take animals up into that kind of an environment that they did not evolve to live in when they have zero choice? Also, another thing, and this really jumped out at me, because one of the main reason that the guys that wrote the Space Settlements and Design Study gave for having animals in these habitats was to make it more Earth-like so people would feel at home. I think that's kind of BS because most people in the United States and other developed nations live in cities. This was true back in the 70s. It's even more true now. So for most people, being around farm animals is not part of their daily experience. So the idea that having sheep and cows and pigs around is going to make it seem more like home is nonsense, because for most people, that's not home at all. Most people live in cities and not on farms. And again, you think about who's going to be going in live in space. I'm sure there will be some people that live on farms that will go up and live in space, but I'll bet the vast majority of people that go to live up in space are going to be coming from cities, not from farms. So yeah, for those people, their day-to-day life experience does not involve being around livestock. So that whole idea kind of goes out the window there. And, another point is, even if people are still eating meat or using animal products to a large degree, even if that is the case, which I don't think it will be, but even if it is, it will be a simple matter to import those things via the space elevator from Earth. So even if that were the case, it would still probably make a lot more sense to raise your cows and your sheep and whatnot on Earth and import the products you need up the space elevator than to try to raise them up in space. And finally, kind of in the same vein, it's just easier and more efficient to raise these things on Earth than in space. So why wouldn't you just do that? Now, I do want to make one little side note here. What I am talking about today is animals living on these cylinders with people. And I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think there will be livestock. I don't think there will be pets. I don't think there will be any kind of animals on cylinders, with a possible few exceptions that I'm going to talk about in a minute. But what may be a thing, though, is there may be habitats in space that are for animals, that are basically nature preserves, places where we could keep endangered species and just animals that we want to make sure survive. There's an argument you could make that it would in some ways be easier to create the perfect environment for a given animal to live in one of these habitats than it would be even here on Earth, because you have control of every aspect of the environment, which you don't have here on Earth. You can't control the weather and the ambient temperature and humidity and things like that nearly as well on Earth as you could in one of these habitats. So I think it's very possible you may have nature preserves in space to preserve endangered species or even species that have gone extinct that they bring back through genetics and whatnot. You might even have things like your Jurassic Park in space where they bring back dinosaurs and other animals that have been gone a long, long time. But they'll be their own places that are just for the animals, that these aren't the cities where people live. They'll be separate cylinders, separate habitats. All right. So to the best of my ability, I gave some reasons why we might have animals with us on these habitats and some reasons why we might not. As I'm sure has been clear to you through this, I'm very much on the side of thinking that we won't. So yeah, on my cylinders and my story, there aren't going to be any animals. There aren't going to be any kind of livestock or chickens or anything like that. And there also aren't going to be cats or dogs or anything like that for all the reasons I just gave. Now, some possible exceptions to this may be in the form of insects. I already mentioned the pollinators. So, for instance, like honeybees, not only do you need some way for these plants to pollinate and cross pollinate, honeybees also can give you honey, which people tend to like. So, maybe we would have honeybees that are raised for honey and also to pollinate. Now, an obvious thing that you think about here is, well, bees sting people, and some people are deathly allergic to bee stings. So I think a solution to that would be through genetic engineering. I think they could probably, over time, come up with a type of honeybee that either cannot or just will not sting. So that's one possibility. Also, mason bees are good pollinators, and they don't sting at all. Of course, they also don't make honey. Another possibility, though, other than insects, is it could be that maybe they would make tiny little robots that are bee-sized that would go around pollinating. But it almost seems like a reinventing the wheel kind of thing. So unless there was a huge drawback to having bees on board, wouldn't it just be easier just to use honeybees? They've already evolved to do that instead of trying to build and produce robots to do it instead. And unlike cats with mice, bees are very good at pollinating. They do that quite well. And yeah, especially if through genetic manipulation or engineering, we can produce bees that just don't sting, then I don't think there'd be much of a drawback to having bees. They don't, they're not going to be destructive to the environment like cows would be. But, something I've been wondering about ever since I started thinking about this is, would honeybees even, quote, work on one of these cylinders? Honeybees are really fascinating. And I know they have a pretty complex, they have pretty complex mechanisms that they use for navigation, for when they find flowers or pollen sources. I believe, if I remember right, they use the sun and shadows and maybe even the Earth's magnetic field. I don't remember all the details, but they have some pretty sophisticated mechanisms that they use to navigate that probably would not work on a cylinder. There's no sun to judge the position of. This would be outside of Earth's magnetic field. Plus, the cylinder is rotating, which could mess with that, I would think. And then there's a little dance that they do that tell the rest of the hive where they can find this food source that this bee has found. So, would bees even work in space? Would they even be able to do their thing on one of these cylinders? I don't know. Nobody knows, I'm sure. I'm sure this isn't something that's been researched yet. So yeah, that would be something to answer. Man, that's a really good question. Other possible exceptions as far as forms of animals that they might have, in my setting at least, might be insects and grubs and things like that, caterpillars that are raised for protein sources. For instance, like crickets and mealworms. Just because they are really good protein sources, they are easy to raise. They don't take a lot of space. They don't take a lot of resources. They're not destructive to the environment like mammals are, larger animals. So that could be a thing. That's something I need to think about. And again, I think, that's something that maybe was more of a thing earlier, but, I'm talking 200 years or so in the future. And probably by then, there have probably been so many plant protein sources developed by then that there's no need. And again, it's a lot easier to raise a plant than even a cricket. So why would you bother if you didn't need to? The only reason would be those cultural holdovers of just people are used to eating their crickets. But again, that will diminish with each generation over time. Another possible exception might be maybe fish or maybe some other kinds of seafood like scallops or shrimp or things like that. They'd be a little easier to contain than large mammals, and the risk for disease transmission wouldn't be as much of a factor. However, this kind of brings up my whole body of questions about whether or not there'd be bodies of water on these things. And I think even having contained enclosed aquariums that you're like raising fish or shrimp or whatever in, that might be a really bad idea that would be avoided. And again, there's just this whole aspect of so much time has passed. And if people are eating these things less and less, would it even be something that would be seen as worth the effort to do? And I think my answer at this point is probably not. So, a big factor for these exceptions, I think, is again, how much have these cultures evolved that are used to eating these things? And how much have they moved away from eating these animal products? How much have they embraced alternatives that are not animal based, that are more environmentally friendly, that are more economical to produce and more efficient to produce, and that are nutritionally superior? And again, I think over time, these things will be embraced more and more. I mean, I just look in my own lifetime at how much things have changed as far as how people think about, I don't know, eating a steak dinner or whatever. And, I'm sure a lot of that's colored by my own perspective and, my little bubble where I live in the world. But at least in my experience, I've seen a huge shift in just my 40 some years on this planet toward a more vegetable based diet and away from animals and animal products. And I think that's going to continue. And I think it's going to accelerate through time. So there we go. Wow, that was longer than I thought it would be. But there are my thoughts. And, I really invite you, if while I was saying this and going through all this, if you had something come to mind, whether for or against the idea of having animals on these habitats, and I did not address it, especially if you feel like it's kind of a big glaring omission, please let me know. I asked the people in the Discord to help me with this, and I've racked my brain about it, but I'm sure there's things I've overlooked. I'm pretty solid on what I'm going to do. So I don't think, you're not going to change my mind as far as whether or not the animals will be there. But any reasons you can give me for or against that I haven't mentioned will just help me in my world building to make sure and build things up in a way so that it makes sense that I made the choices that I did, and it makes sense in the setting. Because that's what's really important. Whatever choice I make, it needs to make sense in the context of the setting I've created. So if there's some huge factor that I've completely overlooking here, please let me know. I really value your input. All right. So that's it. I really hope I hear from any of you that have any thoughts that I may have overlooked about why we may or may not take animals to live with us in space. If you have anything like that you'd like to share with me, you can email me at lexoutloudpodcast@gmail.com. Another great way to keep up on me and what I'm up to is to follow me on Twitter at LexStarWalker. And finally, if you have something you'd like to say, you can call my voicemail 951-465-5391, and you can leave me a message, and I might even play part or all of it on the show. Really, really happy to get voicemails from people. So again, that number is 951-465-5391. And finally, another great way to connect with myself as well as other listeners of the show and other writers, creatives, and gamers is to join our community on Discord. And you can find a link to that in the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com/LOL. Also in those show notes, you can find a link to my Patreon page if you'd like to check that out and consider becoming a patron of the show. And you can also find a link to my support page on the website where I have some other ways that you can help me out and help support the show other than becoming a patron. So if Patreon isn't your thing, or if you don't want to do a monthly patronage or whatever, there are other possibilities for you. You can make one-time donations on my website, and I have Amazon referral link. You can use the shop on Amazon, and then I get a little kickback from that. And there's some other things too. So you can check that out at starwalkerstudios.com. So I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and I hope I spurred some thoughts. If you are like me and you were just making an assumption one way or the other about whether or not we take animals into space, and had never really questioned that assumption or never really thought about it, hopefully I gave you some food for thought. So I will see you soon for another episode. And until then, keep writing.